Jane Manning up there.
I'm just reading about her. She died in 1958 in a car accident. That's 56. Well, anyway, we'll get started this morning. Well, thank you for coming. And I know it's cold. Man, is it cold? So, Marge, if you don't have any, do we have any, everything under control?
What does that mean? Please expand on that.
And the class.
No, we're glad to be back. But I want to tell you this, that everything with Zoom, I was looking at it critically, you know, because I know it went so well where we were in our resort and we visited last time. It was good. Everything, yeah, it was very good. Yeah, I'll talk to you.
Well, I'm really glad that we're getting good responses about the latest improvements with our system. And I want to thank Abner again. I had my doubts and I couldn't pull it off. I don't know why. Boy, it's brilliant, obviously. But I did have a lot of anxiety about could we ever get this going in the right direction. I think we're on the cusp of getting something that will really work. Fortunately for you, I could not teach our class today because I was overwhelmed with a couple of major deals, and I'm trying to close out, or was supposed to close out by the end of the year. That didn't happen, so we'll see how it goes this month. But we're grateful you came. More will be coming. I don't know of anything else I need to add to that. We're grateful for the people who are now beginning to have a chance to hear us better and to see us better. And I think we'll be getting this. Hopefully, we won't need it as much.
I don't think we have to flip the rooms.
Yeah.
That's working.
Yeah, and as you know, as far as vaccines, we're a long way from that. I was on the Zoom call with our mayor. I know some of you are not interested in politics, but locally we are way behind on vaccines. It has been a fiasco getting people just to Amicaloa Highway, Chattanooga State. Hundreds of cars are backing up, you know, and so we're going now on a schedule. But it doesn't matter until we get vaccines. We're supposed to arrive this coming Tuesday, but there won't be enough to even do the 75 and over. So diligence will be our key word, I guess, here. With that said, Ruth, would you have our prayer this morning? Ruth Lewis.
Our Father in heaven, we're so grateful for your care for us. In spite of these very chaotic times, Lord, you have preserved us. You have been with us. And I thank you so much. Today, as we open your word, I ask that your Holy Spirit be here with us and that you will be with Doug as he teaches us. Thank you so much. In Jesus' name, amen.
I want to thank Doug for having mercy on me and jumping in the line and teaching. Thank you, Doug.
Glad to do it, Ken. And if there is trouble with either the audio or the video, please let me know so that we can correct that. Right now, from my end, it seems to be working well. For those of you who have not been with us recently, or perhaps you are just new to our class, let me give a little bit of background of where we are in this story. Today, we are studying 2 chapters in 2 Samuel. We're studying 2 Samuel chapter 16 and 17. And if you were to just drop in and read these 2 chapters, they could seem chaotic and complex and puzzling. And I will admit that that is all true. There's a lot of that in those chapters. And I will also admit that we will not answer all the questions. We will not touch on every detail. We will read both chapters aloud. And unlike in the past, when I have read without comment, I'm going to read with a few comments this time. And not long, because I want to read through those 2 chapters aloud, make a few brief comments, and then we're going to look at 3 large themes in these 2 chapters. But let me back up and give a little bit of background. As you might remember, the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel are really the same book. 1st and 2nd Samuel were all the book of Samuel for generations. And back in the day when the writings were kept in scrolls, it was too large to put all of 1st and 2nd Samuel in one scroll. And so it was put in 2 scrolls. And so you had the 1st scroll of Samuel and the 2nd scroll of Samuel. And so they were really all the same book. And yet we have them the same way now in our Bible, divided into 1st and 2nd Samuel. And 1st and 2nd Samuel lay the foundation for the story of the monarchy. How did Israel end up going from a people who was ruled by God and some leaders that God chose to share that leadership and to be his representatives to the people, prophets and priests and so forth, later judges? How did it go from that setup to being a monarchy? And the book of Samuel, or as we have it, 1st and 2nd Samuel, tells the story of how that happened. It tells the story of the first king Saul and the second king David. And it really ends with just those 2 stories. Well, even more interesting than that is that this book was answering even a bigger question. Not just the beginning of the monarchy, but the end of the monarchy. How was it that several hundred years later, this whole thing imploded, fell in on itself with such catastrophe and with such damage to everybody? And people were asking those questions and saying, what went wrong? Why did this whole thing implode? And so the stories that had been collected for years, for generations, for several hundred years, were pulled together, edited in a way to show a clear train of thought. And what we have in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, or the book of Samuel, is a story that answers the bigger question: what went wrong? Why did the wheels come off this thing? Why did the monarchy collapse? And what difference does that make? What do we have to learn from this? And so the book of Samuel is answering a big question about how God works with his people. And now let me take it to the largest level. The largest level is this. Today we can shrug our shoulders and yawn at what happened to some ancient kingdom far away and long ago and say, who cares? Well, the reason anybody should care is that the way that God was working with his people then tells us something about how he's working not only with us now, but how he's working with people across the span of human history. And what is God doing with humanity that matters so much that we have the details here in a microcosm of how he was dealing with a group of individuals over time and with his chosen people. And so really the book of Samuel is a microcosm of what God is doing with humanity. Now, I've just taken you from a zoom lens, well, in a moment, from a way wide angle down to a zoom lens, because now what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in and we're going to see one story in the life of one king, and that one story has incredible detail to it. But remember, those details fit into this much, much bigger picture. Any comments or questions so far? I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Okay, now in a moment, we're going to read this, but let me give you just one little bit more background. Let me back up and tell you what's been going on for the last dozen years or so. We've been studying, like I said, the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, focusing on the life of David. And if you know very little else about David, you probably know about David and Goliath, and that's near the beginning of his life when he's a teenager. And you know about David and Bathsheba, and that's when he's in his 50s and he's been on the throne for some 20 years or so as king. And this story that we're in now is the aftermath of the David and Bathsheba story. After David's sexual assault of Bathsheba, we have quite an unraveling of David's life, of David's family, and David's kingdom. And if you turn back to 2 Samuel, chapter 11 is the story of David and Bathsheba. And then we come to chapter 12, and about a year has gone by, because what we have is the birth of this child that is the result of that illicit sexual incident. And then in chapter 12 also, we have Nathan confronting David, saying, "You are the man," and giving certain statements about what David could expect. Even though God had forgiven him, there was still going to be consequences from this horrible thing that he had done. And that's chapter 12. Then we get to chapter 13, and we begin to see some of those consequences playing out. And we see in David's household, in his family, we have incest and rape and murder. And we see the political intrigue that is surrounding all of that. And it centers around two of his sons, his firstborn son and his thirdborn son. Apparently, his secondborn son died in infancy. So we have the two contenders for the throne, Amnon, who is the firstborn, and Absalom, who is the thirdborn. And what unfolds is the story of the rape of the sister and the way that these two brothers relate to that, and how Amnon is assassinated by Absalom for what he did to his sister Tamar. And Absalom lets 2 years go by before he has Amnon assassinated. And then he flees the country, and he's gone for 3 years. So there's 5 years. And David does nothing. David is paralyzed and does nothing about what's going on in his family. And finally, he brings Absalom back. And Absalom is in Jerusalem 2 years before David will even see him. And so now we've had, what is that, 2 + 3 + 2? We have 7 years gone by. And then finally, when he does see him, there is some sort of reconciliation between the father and the apparent heir to the throne, because he is now the oldest living son. And yet it doesn't look like he's going to get the throne, and he is eager to stir things up and to do whatever he can to get that throne. And we have in chapter 15, the beginning of Absalom's conspiracy, which he runs for 4 years. So now we have 9 years that have gone by since his sister was raped, and probably at least 10 or 12 since the Bathsheba incident. But all of this is the aftermath of what took place with David and Bathsheba. And so we're now 10, 12 years down the line from that, and we're beginning to see this thing unravel and the wheels come off, and David's kingdom in danger. And what we read last week and what we studied last week in chapter 15 was the conspiracy that becomes full blown, and Absalom makes his move for the throne, and David flees Jerusalem. And where we are today in the story is David is on his way out, fleeing from Jerusalem. We read about that in chapter 15, and you might remember that chapter 15 is divided into 2 parts. The first part, chapter 15, verses 1 through 12, describes the people who are against David and what's going on with the Absalom group. And chapter 15, verses 13 through 37, describes the friends of David who are loyal to him and accompanying him out of Jerusalem, and who are working to help him, to protect him. So we have chapter 15 with David fleeing, first part of the chapter telling about those who were against him, the last part of the chapter telling about those who are for him. Now, that's a quick review of where we are, because now we come to chapters 16 and 17. And what we're looking at today is 3 themes. When we studied chapter 15, we looked at 2 themes. We looked at those things in our past that we regret and that come back to haunt us. And certainly David had plenty that was coming back to haunt him. But we also look at those things in our past that help us. And there was much in David's past that was there to help him. And we looked at those two things, what helps us, what haunts us from our past in chapter 15. Today, we're looking at three themes in chapters 16 and 17. And those three themes have to do with loyalty, lessons, and love. And there's a lot here just in those three themes, let alone in all the details of the chapter. My hope is this, is that while we may touch down on some of those details, and we certainly need to in order to understand what's going on, that we're going to focus on those three big themes more than we're going to focus on all the little details. And if some questions come up about those details, we may or may not deal with them depending on how relevant they are, how long it takes to go through them. But mostly, I want you to see these bigger themes as part of the big picture of where this story is going. So I'm going to read through this chapter, these two chapters, chapter 16 and 17, making very brief comments. And then we're going to come back and discuss those three themes that we see in chapter 16 and 17. Before I do that, before I start reading, let me just see if there's any questions, comments about anything I've said so far that would help us as we jump into reading of Scripture. The floor is open. I don't see any hands. I don't hear any voices. So I'm going to move forward in just a moment if there's nobody with a question or comment. Okay, let's begin reading. So 2 Samuel chapter 16 starts this way. When David had gone a short distance beyond the summit, there was Ziba. Now, this is, again, continuing the story of chapter 15. He has gone out of Jerusalem, down into the Kidron Valley, and up on the other side of the valley is Mount of Olives, and he is climbing to the summit of Mount of Olives. When David had gone a short distance beyond the summit, there was Ziba, the steward of Mephibosheth, waiting to meet him. He had a string of donkeys saddled and loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 cakes of raisins, 100 cakes of figs, and a skin of wine. The king asked Ziba, "Why have you brought these?" Ziba answered, "The donkeys are for the king's household to ride on. The bread and fruit are for the men to eat, and the wine is to refresh those who become exhausted in the desert." The king then asked, "Where's your master's grandson?" Ziba said to him, "He is staying in Jerusalem because he thinks, today the house of Israel will give me back my grandfather's kingdom." Then the king said to Ziba, "All that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." "I humbly bow," Ziba said. "May I find favor in your eyes, my lord, the king." Now, this is a bit of a puzzling part of this story, and we're not going to spend a long time on it. We will come back to it. But you might remember Mephibosheth is the only living grandson, or son for that matter, of King Saul. And Ziba is his servant who had once served Saul. And so this is an interesting piece of political history that goes way back and predates Absalom's rebellion. And it looks like Mephibosheth is thinking that somehow out of all of this chaos, he may benefit. But keep in mind that this is coming out of Ziba's mouth. And the question is Ziba telling the truth or not? Or does Ziba see this as a chance to promote himself? Now, David's reaction to it is interesting because David seems to take Ziba at his word right there. And by his right as king, he transfers all of the property that had belonged to Mephibosheth over to David. And you might remember this seems in great contrast to what David had done earlier, because Mephibosheth is crippled. And David had said, "You come and live with me, always eat at my table, I'll take care of you." So this is an interesting, puzzling part of the story. We'll just leave it at that for right now. Verse 5, here's the next encounter. By the way, we had 3 encounters in chapter 15 with the encounter that we'll come back to there with Ittai, and then we had the encounter with Zadok, and with the encounter with Hushai. So we have 3 encounters as he is leaving Jerusalem, and all 3 of those are loyal people to him. They're people that are friends. And now these others seem a little bit dicey. There's something something that seems wrong with each of these next encounters. And of course, this one is pretty obvious. There's no mystery about this one. So here we come to chapter 16, verse 5. As King David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family. And you notice a theme here, that he is being approached by people who have old grudges that go clear back to Saul. As King David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there. His name was Shimei, son of Gera, and he cursed as he came out. He pelted David and all the king's officials with stones, though all the troops and the special guard were on David's right and left. As he cursed, Shimei said, get out, you man of blood, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has handed the king over to your son Absalom. You have come to ruin, because you are a man of blood. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head. But the king said, what do you and I have in common, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord has said to him, curse David, who can ask, why do you do this? David said to Abishai and all his officials, my son, who is my own flesh, is trying to take my life. How much more than this Benjamite? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will see my distress and repay me with good for the cursing I am receiving today. So David and his men continued along the road while Shimei was going along the hillside opposite him, cursing as he went and throwing stones at him and showering him with dirt. The king and all his people with him arrived at their destination exhausted, and there he refreshed himself. Now, just the briefest of comments on this, you might again puzzle, why did he let this guy get away with this? And why didn't he send Abishai over there to take care of him? Do you remember what happened back in chapter 15, just last week? If you look at verse 25, and Ken, you made the comment, which I think was very apt. Then in verse 25 of chapter 15, you see David in the middle of a crisis, really acting quite nobly. And here in chapter 15, verse 25, then the king said to Zadok the priest, take the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it in his dwelling place again. But if he says, I'm not pleased with you, then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him. You've got to read this in the context of what's been going on the last 12 years. David's past is haunting him. David's past is also helping him. David realized, David realized that his incident with Bathsheba is far from over, that the consequences of that are cascading in his life, in his children's lives, in the lives of his people. And that when Nathan said to him on that fateful day, you are the man, and the sword will never leave your house. God has forgiven you, but there will be a fourfold payment required. David doesn't know really what's going to happen. He is confident of God's love for him and God's ultimate big plan for him. He knows that, but he's not so sure what discipline is going to come along the way and whether what's happening now is going to end up in immediate ruin or not. He does not know. And so what he says here in verse 25, and Ken, you aptly said, there's a lot to admire in David there, because he says, God, I'm trusting you, even though I don't know what's going to happen. I have done some horrible things, and I know those consequences are still haunting me. And if that's what I have to go through yet, okay, but I'm going to trust you, God. That's what he says in verse 25. And we have the same spirit over here in chapter 16 with what he says to Abishai. He says, my son, who is my own flesh, is trying to take my life. How much more than this Benjamite? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will see my distress and repay me with good for the cursing I am receiving today. Same attitude, just probably an hour or two later, he exercises here now towards somebody who's cursing him that he said towards Zadok, the priest, when he said, take the ark back. So only comment there, but just kind of notice the flow of what's going on here and how David is relating to all of this. Then chapter 15, I'm sorry, chapter 16, verse 15. Meanwhile, so now we're going to have the focus shift back to what's going on in Jerusalem as Absalom is occupying the city. Let's go there. Meanwhile, Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with them. Now, you might remember that back in chapter 15, one of the defining moments for David fleeing the city was that one of his most trusted counselors, Ahithophel, had switched loyalties and had gone to Absalom's side. But Marlene, as you pointed out last week, and accurately, we won't turn to the scripture passage there, but Ahithophel is Bathsheba's granddaddy. Bathsheba's grandfather is Ahithophel, and here are repercussions that happen, and it's no small incident that he turns away from David, and he turns his loyalty from David to Absalom, and probably much has to do with a sense of family honor and revenge for what David had done to Bathsheba. So here we see Ahithophel popping up in the story again. Meanwhile, Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with them. Then Hushai, now you remember Hushai is David's friend that we met at the end of chapter 15, who David says, no, don't come with me. You can do more good if you go into the palace and pretend that you are loyal to Absalom, just like Ahithophel has turned against me. You act as if you've turned against me, but you can be there to undo the counsel of Ahithophel. So this is where this politics is playing out. Meanwhile, Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. Then Hushai the Archite, David's friend, went to Absalom and said to him, long live the king, long live the king. Absalom asked Hushai, is this the love you show your friend? Why didn't you go with your friend? Hushai said to Absalom, no, the one chosen by the Lord, by these people and by all the men of Israel, his I will be, and I will remain with him. Furthermore, whom should I serve? Should I not serve the son? Just as I served your father, so I will serve you. Absalom said to Ahithophel, give us your advice. What should we do? Ahithophel answered, lie with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all of Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench in your father's nostrils, and the hands of everyone with you will be strengthened. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he lay with his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now in those days, the advice of Ahithophel was like that of one who inquires of God. This was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. The very first thing that Ahithophel tells Absalom to do is to burn your bridges. You sleep with your father's concubines, and notice the irony, it's on the same rooftop where the whole incident with Bathsheba started, and this is Ahithophel, Bathsheba's grandfather, saying, you sleep with all of these concubines and let everybody know you're doing it, and you will have burned your bridges behind you, and everybody will rally behind you and say, this is the new guy in charge of the palace. And that's Ahithophel's advice, and that's exactly what Absalom does. Well, the story goes on in chapter 17, verse 1. Ahithophel said to Absalom, I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he is weary and weak. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee. I would strike down only the king and bring all the people back to you. The death of the man that you seek will mean the return of all. All the people will be unharmed. This plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel. And actually, it was a very strategically smart plan. Ahithophel knew David well, and he was giving excellent advice in terms of what would strengthen Absalom. He gives him two pieces of advice, one on taking possession and immediately showing that he's in charge by what he does with the palace and the concubines, And then he says, now get out there and just kill your father. Don't kill anybody else. Just strike hard, strategically, a laser strike right at your dad. Kill him and have everybody on your side. And it was actually strategically smart advice. But notice what happens. Verse 5, but Absalom said, summon also Hushai the Archite, so we can hear what he has to say. When Hushai came to him, Absalom said, Ahithophel has given this advice. Should we do what he says? If not, give us your opinion. I want you to notice as we read what Hushai says, that what he says has a lot in it to appeal to Absalom's vanity. And Ahithophel has given his advice clearly, briefly, concisely, just do this, 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 and this. Notice the difference in how Hushai approaches this. And his advice is actually rather ridiculous, but he couches it in a way that appeals to Absalom's vanity. And we know that Absalom was a vain guy. Remember in chapter 15, we read about the 50 men he had running ahead of himself and his horse chariots, and the way that he cut his hair every year with everybody looking on at how beautiful he was. I mean, there was vanity clearly in Absalom, very ambitious, very vain, very narcissistic, and Hushai appeals to that. And notice the thing he says, verse 7. Hushai replied to Absalom, the advice Ahithophel given is not good this time. You know your father and his men. They are fighters and as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father is an experienced fighter. He will not spend the night with the troops. Even now, he is hidden in the cave or some other place. If he should attack your troops first, whoever hears about it will say, there's been a slaughter among the troops who follow Absalom. Then even the bravest soldier, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt with fear, for all Israel knows that your father is a fighter and that those who with him are brave. So I advise you, let all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand of the seashore, be gathered to you, and you yourself leading them into battle. Then we will attack him wherever he may be found, and we will fall on him as dew settles on the ground. Neither he nor any of his men will be left alive. If he withdraws into a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city, and we will drag it down to the valley until not even a piece of it can be found. Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel. And here, I believe, is the key verse of this entire story. For the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. Just note that last half of verse 14. We're going to come back to it. For the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. So continuing on, verse 15, Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar the priest. Now you remember, they had been following David also, and back in chapter 15, David had sent them back into Jerusalem to be spies. Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar the priest, Ahithophel has advised Absalom and the elders of Israel to do such and such, but I have advised him to do so and so. Now send a message immediately and tell David, do not spend the night at the fords in the desert. Cross over without fail, or the king and all the people with him will be swallowed up. Jonathan and Ahimaaz were staying at En-Rogel. A servant girl was to go and inform them, and they were to go and tell King David, for they could not risk being seen entering the city. But a young man saw them and told Absalom. So the two of them left quickly and went to the house of a man in Behurim. He had a well in his courtyard, and they climbed down into it. His wife took a covering and spread it over the opening of the well and scattered grain over it. No one knew anything about it. When Absalom's men came to the woman at the house, they asked, where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan? The woman answered them, no, they crossed the brook. The men searched, but found no one, so they returned to Jerusalem. After the men had gone, the two climbed out of the well and went to inform King David. They said to him, set out and cross the river at once. Ahithophel has advised such and such against you. So David and all the people with him set out and crossed the Jordan. By daybreak, no one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. When Ahithophel saw his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order and then hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb. David went to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. Absalom had appointed Amasa over the army in place of Joab. Amasa was the son of a man named Jether, an Israelite who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash and sister of Zeruiah, the mother of Joab. The Israelites and Absalom camped in the land of Gilead. When David came to Mahanaim, Shobi, son of Nahash, from Rabbah of the Ammonites, and Maker, son of Amiel, from Lodebar, and Barzillai, the Gileadite of Roglim, brought bedding and bowls and articles of pottery. They also brought wheat and barley, flour and roasted grain, beans and lentils, honey and curd, sheep and cheese from cows, milk for David and his people to eat. For they said, the people have become hungry and tired and thirsty in the desert. Whew, that's quite a story, isn't it? Well, we've spent a while looking at the story. I've made some brief comments. I want to look at those three themes with you now of loyalty, lessons, and love. Before we do, I certainly want to open the floor up again for any questions, comments that are just broadly about this story. And like I said, we can't go into every detail. That's not our purpose today. But if there's something that is coming to your mind, either big picture or small detail, I'm happy to take a moment or two right now to consider questions and comments.
Can you hear me, Doug?
I can. Hey, John.
Good morning, sir. Back in the previous chapter, David sent Abiathar and Zadok back to Jerusalem with the ark.
Mm-hmm.
It had not been too many years previous to this that Hophni and Phinehas had taken the ark into battle, and it had been captured.
Yeah.
David realized that it was not the ark that gave victory. It was the quality of character God was looking for. That's why God chose it in the first place. God looks on the heart, not on the outside.
Yep.
So this was a test of loyalty, and in crisis, David routinely returned to God, and he was demonstrating his loyalty to his Creator.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Good comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Any big or small observations on details or on? Oh, I see here a note saying we lost sound. Candy Reichert says we lost sound. Abner, any comment on that?
No, we've got sound coming from you that might be on her end. Marlene was also having some issues as well.
Uh-oh. Okay, I'm
But
sorry.
you're coming in clear.
Okay. Any other comments? I'm just going to take a moment longer on this. Caitlin, glad you can hear. Good. Okay. Yes, I've got a comment from Marlene, I think, is it, or?
No, here in class.
Oh, okay, and then Roy has a comment, please.
Go ahead.
Okay, I was reading last night from Patriarchs and Prophets, and I've read it multitudes of times, but because of this story and the way we've been studying David's life, it came through loud and clear. And when I was visiting with people on the phone and so forth over Christmas and after Christmas, it stresses in there that David was in depression. He was in a deep state of depression.
Yeah.
And his thinking was not clear as God would have it to be, being in this state of depression. And as I was talking to these different people, there are a lot of people right now in a state of depression.
Yeah.
And that hit me, like I'd never thought of David quite that way.
Yeah.
And now as we see it being played out, and that God, that he is still trusting in God, let him do to me whatever seems good to him. That's where we need to go with our depression.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And you just read some of the Psalms and you realize David had a very rich, but also very roller coaster emotional life.
Exactly.
Thank you. John, Roy, I think you had a comment, and maybe we have time for one more after Roy's, and that would be Marley.
Actually, my comment is a question on
Okay.
verse 14 that you pointed out for us. How did the grandfather Bathsheba decide that because his counsel was not taken, that he was lost?
I don't think he did decide that he was lost. I think that if you would just look at this at a very surface level, and we could look at a number of levels, he realized that the kingdom was lost. Absalom had burned his bridges behind him based on his counsel. And now, following Hushai's advice, and this is a rather long and involved answer, but let me be brief here. He realized he was smart enough to see that Absalom's whole cause was lost, and that if David got his hands on him, his fate would be much worse, and he'd just go ahead and take his own life. Now, in terms of his spiritual condition, his depression, and so forth, but I think it's a fairly pragmatic move, kind of like Saul falling on his own sword, saying, I'm not going to fall into the hands of these people who are going to torture me. So that's the brief answer I'll give there, but I think that it's an astute observation that this matter of Ahithophel hanging himself does say something about he realized how the cause was hopeless now. Marlene, you had a comment.
Yes, can you hear me well?
Yes.
You know, sometimes, and I don't know why this happens, and I don't want to just think about one person, but this keeps coming back to me, Ahithophel. What many times we do dumb things based on stressful situations. Ahithophel, from my viewpoint, should have negotiated with David that my granddaughter is going to be the queen, and my grandson is going to be the king. Instead, he's supporting Absalom, although he's hurting the future of his granddaughter and the great grandson. So he lost sight of the bigger picture because of wanting to be vengeful for the short term. And it makes me think a little bit further, you know, not just let your emotions allow you to carry you to make some foolish decisions that you're going to regret.
Very good observation. Thank you, Marlene. Did I miss any hand? I'm going to move on because we have much to cover as we look at these three themes, but I wanted to hear any general observations you had before we went on. So let me start with the first of those three themes. Oh, please, one more in the class.
It's me again, Doug.
Hi, John.
Good morning, sir. Since Ahithophel had counseled Absalom to sleep with all the concubines, and he did, since he was Bathsheba's grandfather, since he did not view Bathsheba as the queen and his grandson being one of the princes, the loss of respect in the Middle East is one of the biggest motivating factors. And after 2 years after this incident with Bathsheba, he was still angry and still trying to get even. And now he had shown his cards to King David. And whenever David came back, because he knew Absalom's cause was lost, when David came back, he might be merciful to his son, but he would show Ahithophel no mercy.
Ahithophel was in real, in a real no-win situation at this point. He really was. Okay, I want us to go to these three themes. Thank you for your comments. I asked you to look at loyalty and lessons and love in the lesson that we sent out. It wasn't that early in the week, so you may not have had a chance to look at it. But I want to spend just a minute. You can go back, you can dip back into chapter 15 all the way to the middle of the chapter where David flees, and start looking at these people who come alongside, who approach him, who have conversations with David. The middle of chapter 15 to the really the middle of chapter 16, and we see pictures of loyalty to David. And then when we have the story of Absalom and his counselors, we have loyalty again in the stories there with Ahithophel and Hushai and Absalom. And so here's the question. Who is loyal to whom and why? Who is disloyal to whom and why? And we could spend an hour just discussing that, but I want to hear 2 or 3 brief thoughts, maybe 3 or 4, on what loyalty pictures stand out to you here. Loyalty or disloyalty pictures that stand out to you in this story. There's many of them, at least a dozen, and we won't explore them all, but which ones stand out most to you in this story about loyalty, disloyalty? Yes, Ken.
I think one thing that struck me is his family.
Yeah.
Other than his son, the rest of his son is disloyal, but there's so many other characters in here that are loyal. This guy that wants to cut the heads off of everybody, Abishai, is to believe to be David's sister's son.
He's a nephew. Yeah, he's a nephew of David.
Yeah. And I see all these people still in the family that are trying to hang in there. I don't know if it's for personal gain or but they're there.
Yeah, they're there. They're alongside this family member. And that's a beautiful picture of loyalty. And you're right, there could be some mixed motives, but for all they know, they're on the losing side.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Ken. Anybody else? Any other issues of loyalty, stories within this story, examples that stand out to you?
Douglas,
Yes, Mother.
it seems like in what we studied last week and this week also, so many of the people who are really and truly for the right motives loyal to David are non-Israelites.
Yes, that is interesting.
The Gentiles, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that's surprising in a way. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a very good observation. Thank you, Mother. Anybody else? A piece of this story that stands out to you as an example of loyalty? Oh, Marlene, I see you have your hand up. Is that true?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Doug, this is Jana.
Hi, Jana.
Hi. I just had never heard that Ahithophel was Bathsheba's relation, and so I kind of looked it up. And what amazes me is, okay, we're talking about David, and sometimes we think about, oh, who is loyal to him? But if you look at that whole ordeal with Bathsheba, 2 of the men who were among his 30 valiant men were affected by this. One, Uriah, he killed, but then Bathsheba's father was also listed as one of the 30.
Yes.
And so it's kind of a cascading effect of David's disloyalty to the men who had been so loyal to him. That all of these other issues of loyalty come out.
Yes. Oh, excellent observation, Jana. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, now, because we have 2 other themes to look at, but we're already beginning to see this issue of loyalty and disloyalty, I want to turn this a slightly different direction. And I'm going to share my screen with you here. And I have a slide to show you right here. Let's see if I can get this up. Can you see my screen?
Gotcha.
Okay, and I've got to change this so that I can make that large. There we go. Okay. What I'd like you to just consider is God's loyalty here. And I didn't use the word loyal, I used the word faithful. But I want you to just pause here and think about this for a second. That God is faithful regardless. Now, that faithfulness doesn't always mean that we're going to get everything that we want or that everything is going to go the way we want. But it does mean that God is faithful. And I want you to consider 2 passages here, and I already see that I have a typo. I said 2 Samuel 7 and 2 Samuel 7 again, but it's actually 2 Samuel 12. So I'm sorry, let me I won't try to change it now. Just know that I've got a typo there. But turn back to 2 Samuel 7. Look at 2 Samuel 7. And this is a number of years earlier when God promises to build David's house. And here in 7, and let's drop down to verse, probably drop all the way down to verse 10. I will provide a place for my people Israel and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did at the beginning and have done ever since this time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. This is Nathan speaking to David, the words of God about the promise, what God is going to do for David and his family. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with the rod of men, with flogging inflicted by men, but my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. Beautiful passage. We don't have time to unpack it all, but just note this. God says to David, I am going to faithfully stick with you. And even when you or your family members blow it, I'm going to stick with you. I'm going to discipline you, and you will be punished with the rod of men. People will come against you, and their activity, their behavior will be part of my discipline in your life. I will punish him with the rod of men and with floggings inflicted by men, but my love will never be taken away. God's faithfulness includes what is happening right now. David realizes that God is preserving him and his family even in the midst of a very difficult time. And if you turn then just a few pages forward to, I've got more than, 2 Samuel 12, that's the typo. Look at just a few pages forward to 2 Samuel 12, and we alluded to this earlier. And this is the correction that comes when Nathan says in verse 7, you are the man. This is what the Lord says, the God of Israel. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. This is what the Lord says. Out of your own household, I am going to bring calamity upon you. Before your very eyes, I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will lie with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this in broad daylight before all Israel. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. But because by doing this you have made the enemies of the Lord show utter contempt, the son born to you will die. And so these two stories have to go together. What happens in chapter 7 with God's promise to his household, but promise of faithfulness to him, and that will include discipline. And chapter 12, that is the pronouncement of some of that discipline. And then when we get into chapter 15 and 16, some of that discipline beginning to happen. God is faithful regardless. And even when we're in the middle of discipline, doesn't mean God has quit being faithful. So the loyalty part of the story that I want you to see before we go on to lessons and to love is that even when we are experiencing terrible things, it does not mean that God has become unfaithful. In fact, in this story of David, we see that part of God's faithfulness is the fact that he is disciplining. And he says, I am not going to let you get away with murder. I'm going to hang in there with you, but I'm going to see to it that there are the consequences that show this is not right, even if I am blessing you and continuing to grow you and your family into the people I want you to be. To me, that is just an amazing part of God's faithfulness that sometimes we don't talk about. And I want you to see that in this story. So we're going to go on to the other two themes in just a moment, and we're down to our last 15 minutes. But any comments or questions about this theme of loyalty, especially God's loyalty, God's faithfulness in the middle of all of this?
Doug, it's Gordon.
Yes, Gordon.
When that phrase appeared on the screen, what I thought to myself was, God is faithful to his character, which is love. And I run across people all the time who have this idea about scriptures or that idea. And often what they say just doesn't make sense with the idea that God is love.
Yeah.
It's like the state of the dead issue, okay? And all these things that we've been reading about in terms of God's interaction with individuals in this earth, there's the faithfulness of, like, towards David, but you can look at that through the lens of his overall love.
Yep, you can. And that is coming back and looking at a wide angle lens, seeing the big picture. Gordon, thank you. I'm going to move on because I really do want us to see these other two themes. Let me take you now to the second theme of lessons. And I asked you to look at this one through this big lens that it says, remember the large lesson of 1st and 2nd Samuel is this: Israel's monarchy failed because of massive pride and resistance of God. Saul led in this national failure, and David, sadly, continued the downward spiral. If that's the large lesson of 1st and 2nd Samuel, how does this story of chapters 16 and 17 contribute to that storyline? And so again, I'm going to invite you to make some comments. How do you see any parts of this story, and you can go back to 15 if you want to, 15, 16, and 17. How does that contribute to this large story that's being told here? Israel's monarchy failed because of massive pride and resistance of God. Saul led in this national failure, and David sadly continued the downward spiral. Let me hear from you. What do you see?
Can I comment again, Doug?
Please, John.
All right, sir. Who the Lord loves, he disciplines and chastens. David was to shepherd God's children, but God was shepherding David. The shepherd has a rod with a crook on the end of it. When he has a sheep that continues to wander away, he will take that sheep and take the crook and break its leg. That means the shepherd has to carry that sheep everywhere. He has to feed it, he has to water it for the next 6 weeks until the leg is grown back together. By the time the shepherd carries that sheep everywhere and loves it like that, the sheep will never leave the shepherd. God loved David enough. He didn't want David to ever leave him.
Wow. Thank you, John. Beautiful picture. Anybody else? How does this story of chapter 15, 16, and 17 fit into this bigger picture of the story that Samuel is telling?
Gordon again?
Okay, Gordon.
That's two.
That's two, yep.
If you look at history, you see that every nation that has risen has ultimately come crashing down. Because the institutions get all bound up, jealousies, pride, and sin, it all just piles up. This seems to me, in a sense, to be the same kind of thing that's going on here. And that's what's going to help bring everything to the end here before Jesus comes back.
Yep. You're right. And that David's pride is even a part of his taking of Bathsheba. I'm king, I can do what I want. Yeah. Anybody else? What do you see in the story? Yes, please.
I think that God was,
gone through to Samuel and told them he didn't want them to have a king because he wanted to be their king.
Yes.
And
Yes,
the
thank you.
outcome of having a king that humans couldn't king,
Yes.
lead the way God could lead. If they had just listened to Samuel and not wanted a king, God could have been their king.
Yes. Yes. And I'm going to use that as the segue to tie together this second point before we go on to the final and third one, because our time is almost up here. But that's exactly right.
Please repeat it. Please repeat it.
Okay, the point is that God had never wanted them to have a king. Remember? That's part of the story of this whole thing. How come the monarchy fell? Well, we have to go clear back to the beginning. God didn't want them to have a monarchy. And this thing is doomed to failure really from the very beginning. And we won't go back and read those passages, but those passages there, Samuel says to him, listen, this is what's going to happen. And it does happen. Now, here's the idea. And notice this. I want you to catch something that may seem a little bit odd here. Again, I'm going to share my screen with you. We come back to this. And why is it not forward and advancing? Oops. Let's try something else. Okay, let's go to this one. This may seem like a really odd place to go. Oh, here we go. Okay. Internal beauty matters most. I want you to just stop and think about this for a second. The people were so caught up with appearances. And one of their biggest reasons for saying we want a king is they say we want to look like everybody else. This is really bizarre for us to have no king. Everybody else has a king. We want to look like everybody else. And when God chooses a king for them, he finally says, let's do this. He chooses a king for them. And that king is a very good looking man. You remember? Saul is head and shoulders above everybody. They say, whoa, he looks like a king. I've got another typo here. I just see 1 Samuel 16:7, that should be, but don't worry about that now. We'll come to that in just a moment. And they get this king and they're proud. They look like all the other nations around them. Now, it's interesting that the Bible doesn't often tell us how people look, but we do have stories about people who are unusually good looking. And oddly enough, the first two kings of Israel, both Saul and David, are described as being good looking people. And the people are proud of that they've got somebody that looks like a king. They're good looking. Now, in the process, we have this story of 1 Samuel 16, it should be 7, where Samuel is going to choose another king at God's direction to replace Saul. And he sees all of the older brothers of David. And they look like kings. And you think, oh, these have got to be it. Because they look like kings. They have a kingly bearing to them. And you remember what God says to Samuel? He says, we probably should look at that. Let me just read it to you. 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 7. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And if they had had that firmly in mind at the very beginning, they wouldn't have even asked for a king. They were so eager to look like everybody else, and they were so captured by this external beauty and the power and the pride of all of that. And God says, I don't look at things that way. I look at the heart. And internal beauty matters most. Now, in today's story, in chapter 14:25, you might remember 2 Samuel 14:25, it pictures that vanity of Absalom. 14:25 says, in all Israel, there was not a man so highly praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the top of his head to the sole of his foot, there was no blemish in him. Whenever he cut the hair of his head, he used to cut his hair from time to time when it would become too heavy for him. He would weigh it, and its weight was 200 shekels by the royal standard. It just, here's a guy who is just really preening. And he had stolen the hearts of all Israel. They were caught up with the same thing then that they were when they wanted a king. External beauty mattered the most to them. And so I would say that one of the big picture here is that God is saying you went down this really wrong path, down this rabbit hole, because external beauty, external qualities, pride mattered more to you than internal. Now, we won't take time to turn there, but I'll just quote it for you. It's interesting that when Jesus comes, who is the final fulfillment of the one who will sit on David's throne, Isaiah 53 says Jesus was not all that good looking. Did you know that? Look it up this afternoon. Isaiah 53 verses 1 and 2 says, actually, I will read it to you. I'll read it to you. Isaiah 53, 1 and 2 is the prophecy of Jesus. And it says, who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up, speaking of Jesus, before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of a dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. Jesus was not like Saul. He was not like David. He was not like Absalom. He was probably fairly ordinary. I'm not saying he was ugly, but there was just nothing outwardly that attracted people to him. Instead, it was the inner beauty that attracted people to Jesus. And when the real king, when the king of the universe came, he didn't rely on the things that people had been so dependent on before. And that was the external beauty to attract them. Instead, it was internal beauty, period, that attracted people to Jesus. So we've got very little time left, but let's wrap up. On the issue of loyalty, God is faithful regardless. On the issue of lessons, hang on just one second. Internal beauty matters most. And we're going to go on to our third and last one in just a couple of minutes, but somebody had a comment. Who was it?
That was Gordon again. This is number 3.
Number 3, Gordon. Okay, you're
Okay,
gotta make it a good one.
It's a good one.
Okay.
You were talking about how the people of Israel were so enamored with beauty. Well, look at David and Bathsheba.
Yeah.
It starts at the individual level, at the corporate level, and at the world level, ultimately.
Yep, you're right. That what happens in the heart of the leader affects the whole nation, which is a really important reason why leaders need character and integrity. Yeah. Okay, let's go to the last one here. And I'm sorry to rush so much. We're down to our last couple minutes. And I'll just share my screen with you here, and I'll have to be very quick. Let me get to my screen here. Sorry for the typos on these things. Sharing my screen and coming back here. And this one. You know, if you just read chapters 16 and 17, you say, where is the love of God in this thing? Well, I pointed you earlier to verse, oops, I'm not at the right place now. There we go. I pointed you earlier to chapter 17, verse 14. Absalom and all the people of Israel said, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel, for the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. We don't hear much about what God is doing in this whole story, but here's one that we do hear. And that God is looking at a bigger picture, and it took time for this whole thing to unfold. In fact, really, it took centuries for it to unfold before we could really see what was going on. But God was working in that moment. And even in the middle of all this chaos and all of this loyalty and disloyalty and the confusion, God is working. And God had something for David, even in the midst of all this, but it wasn't just for David, and it wasn't just for David's family. It was ultimately for the whole world. And what comes of Jesus sitting on David's throne. And I want us to close with Hebrews 12, verses 5 to 11. And I don't think that one is a typo. In the New Testament, the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, verses 5 to 11. And listen to this in the light of all that we've talked about today, and in the light of what happened with chapter 7 of 2 Samuel and chapter 12 of 2 Samuel, where Nathan says, on the one hand, God is going to build your house, but then on the other hand, you are the man, and there will be consequences for this because God is going to hold you accountable. They both work together. And here in Hebrews 12, we see this happening together. Look at Hebrews 12, verses 5 through 11. And you have forgotten the word of encouragement that addresses you as sons. My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline. Do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines those he loves, and he punishes everyone he accepts as a son. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as sons. For what son is not disciplined by his father? If you are not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are illegitimate children and not true sons. Moreover, we've all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of our spirits and live? Our fathers disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Could I suggest to you that when we are looking for God's love in this story or any story, we really do have to take the long view. And the writer of Hebrews invites us to take that long view and to say, when things aren't going well, when it looks like it's all hardship, stop and ask yourself, is there something here of God's discipline in this? And is this happening because God is really concerned about how I and my family and the people around me grow in character? So maybe that's a place to end. I know there's much more discussion we could have, but thank you for engaging with me in this study of what can be a complex and confusing story, and yet it has these big themes of loyalty, and lessons, and love. Ken, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Doug. Yeah. 2 years ago, my son, probably 25 at the time, and he was out on his own, he'd gotten a good job, but he wanted a house. So he wanted a house in North Chattanooga, which I don't live in. Every house, such a housing shortage, even before now. And so anyway, there's nothing but old homes. I go and meet with him. We start looking at houses, and they're all a disaster. Floors are going like this. The roofs are going like this. And this is what I do. I build. And so, Joel, we don't need to do this. Let's find, no, this is where Normal Park School's just right up the street. That's what makes this so bad. All his friends were there. So I said, this is going to end up in a disaster. And it did. But because of my feelings for my son, we do things. God's feelings toward Israel, even though he was way ahead of what's going to happen, sometimes you just can't say no to people you love. So you just do the best that you can. And I thought about that. He ended up later with a pretty good house. He learned a lot. I think we learn from these lessons that we're far better off than just thinking, oh, this just happens. There's a reason. Everything happens for a reason. I didn't believe that. Every disaster happens for a reason. Every bad thing that happened to me happened for a reason. So next week, I do hope to lead your discussion. And it will be another disaster story. But I've decided, I think, how to make it work for us. So hopefully we'll have a good time. Why don't you have our prayer?
Our loving Father, and we thank you for the privilege that we have of coming together and sharing your love and meeting with people like minds. We pray that we will be able to prepare our lives for your second coming.
Thank you. See you next week.